In 1891, before the church bells rang at dawn, a dog began to howl in a way the village had never heard before. It was not the cry of hunger or the sharp bark at passing horses. It was long and low, drawn from somewhere deep, as if the animal were warning the earth itself. The sound rolled across the frost-covered fields and slipped between the wooden houses of the village, waking those who slept lightly and troubling those who carried old fears in their hearts. The dog belonged to Elias Turner, a widowed farmer who lived at the far edge of the settlement where the dirt road gave way to open land. Elias had buried his wife 3 winters earlier, and since then had spoken more to his dog than to any man. The animal, a broad-shouldered shepherd with a thick coat and steady eyes, had been his only steady companion through long harvests and longer nights. The village of Briar Hollow lay quiet in those days, surrounded by fields of corn stubble and a dark line of forest that pressed close like a watchful wall. Wooden fences leaned with age, and smoke from chimneys drifted low in the cold air. Nothing much disturbed the order of life there, until that morning. Elias rose from his narrow bed when he heard the howl. He lit an oil lamp and stepped onto his porch. The dog stood near the old well beyond the barn, paws planted in the frozen earth, head lifted toward the pale sky. When Elias called his name, the dog did not come. He only turned his head slightly, eyes fixed on something near the ground. That was the first sign that something had changed. At dawn, Elias walked toward the well, boots crunching on frost. The dog began to dig beside the stone ring, scraping furiously at a patch of hardened soil. Elias frowned. The well had long been dry. It had been sealed years ago after the water turned bitter. No one went near it anymore. "Leave it," Elias muttered. But the dog did not obey. Instead, he whined and scratched harder, then stopped and pressed his ear to the ground. That was when Elias felt it too. A faint tremor beneath the earth, so slight he might have imagined it. He knelt and placed his palm against the soil. There it was again, a dull, distant thud. He straightened slowly, his breath rising in pale clouds. Wells did not tremble. Earth did not thud. By midday, the dog had not moved from that spot. He refused food. He refused water. He only circled the well, digging, pausing, listening. Word traveled quickly in Briar Hollow. By afternoon, 2 neighbors stood at Elias's fence, hats in hand. They watched the animal with uneasy faces. "Strange behavior," one said. "Dogs sense storms," the other offered, though the sky was clear. But then something happened that no one expected. As the sun lowered, the dog let out a sharp bark and lunged toward the wooden cover that sealed the old well. He began clawing at it with desperate force. The wood creaked under his weight. Elias felt a tightening in his chest. Against his better judgment, he fetched a crowbar from the barn. The neighbors protested. The well had been closed for a reason. Old wells were dangerous. But Elias could not ignore the dog's insistence. There was something in the animal's eyes, something urgent, almost pleading. The first plank came loose with a splintering crack. A cold breath rose from below, not the smell of earth or stale water. Something else. Damp. Foul. Forgotten. The dog whined and tried to push past Elias. "Hold," Elias whispered, though his own hands trembled. They removed the boards one by one until the dark mouth of the well lay open beneath the fading light. Elias lowered his lamp carefully over the edge. The flame flickered wildly. For a moment, he saw nothing but blackness. Then the light caught on something pale far below. Fabric. And then, a hand. Elias staggered back as if struck. The neighbors leaned in, their faces draining of color. No one spoke for a long moment. The only sound was the dog's restless pacing and the faint creak of rope as Elias studied the lamp. There was a body at the bottom of the well. And it was not old. The sheriff was summoned from the neighboring town before nightfall. He arrived on horseback, lantern swinging at his side. The villagers gathered at a distance, whispering in low voices as the sky darkened to ink. Ropes were lowered. 2 men descended carefully into the well. When they brought the body up, the truth began to settle over Briar Hollow like a heavy fog. It was Thomas Reed. Thomas had been missing for 5 days. He was a traveling merchant who had passed through the village with bolts of cloth and small luxuries. He had shared supper at the inn, laughed with the men, and spoken of moving west by spring. On the 3rd night, he vanished. Some said he had left before dawn. Some said he had debts. But now he lay cold and silent on Elias Turner's land. The murmurs grew sharper. Eyes shifted toward Elias. The sheriff asked questions in a calm, measured voice. Elias answered each one steadily, though his heart pounded like a drum in his ears. He had never met Thomas Reed before the man's passing through town. He had no reason to harm him, but suspicion, once born, does not die easily. That night, Elias sat alone in his cabin. The dog lay at his feet, head resting on worn boots. Outside, the wind moved softly through the fields. Elias stared at the lamp flame. He replayed the moment again and again. Why had the dog known? Why that well? What had drawn him there? The next morning, before the sheriff returned to question him again, the dog rose suddenly and went to the door. He barked once, sharp and clear. Then he trotted toward the tree line beyond the field. Elias hesitated only a moment before following. The ground near the forest was softer, shaded from frost. The dog moved with purpose, nose low, weaving between trunks and fallen branches. Twice he stopped, sniffed deeply, then continued. They came to a clearing where the earth was disturbed. Boot prints. 2 sets. One larger, one smaller. Elias knelt, tracing the shapes in the dirt. The smaller prints matched the boots Thomas Reed had worn at the inn. The larger ones were unfamiliar. The dog growled softly and moved deeper into the trees. And then, something changed. Ahead, through the thin veil of branches, stood a small abandoned hunting cabin long forgotten by most of the village. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. Its door hung crooked on rusted hinges. The dog approached slowly. A shadow shifted inside. Elias felt his throat tighten. Before he could call out, the dog barked fiercely and charged through the open doorway. There was a crash, a shout, and the sound of a struggle. Elias rushed forward. Inside the dim cabin, a man stumbled backward, tripping over a broken chair as the dog clamped onto his sleeve. The man's face was pale, eyes wild. It was Samuel Grady, a farmhand from the southern fields. He had argued with Thomas Reed at the inn. Many had seen it. The sheriff arrived soon after, summoned by Elias's shouts echoing across the trees. Under questioning, and faced with the dog's relentless growling, Samuel's composure cracked. The truth came slowly, but it came. There had been a fight over money, a debt unpaid. Anger turned violent. In panic, Samuel had hidden the body in the nearest place he believed no one would look, the old well at the edge of Elias Turner's land. He had counted on silence. He had not counted on a dog. When Samuel was led away in irons, the village stood quiet. Shame moved through them like a passing storm. They had doubted Elias. They had whispered. And it was the dog who had spoken without words. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond Briar Hollow. Not of the crime alone, but of the animal who refused to rest until the truth was uncovered. Elias repaired the well and sealed it properly. He mended his fences and returned to his fields. But something had shifted within him. Where once there had been only loneliness, there was now a quiet pride. On winter evenings, when snow pressed against the windows and the world outside turned white and still, Elias would sit by the fire with the dog at his side. He would rest his weathered hand on the animal's thick fur and remember that morning howl. In a village where suspicion had nearly taken root, loyalty had risen instead. Years later, when children asked about the old well, their elders would speak softly of the winter when a widowed farmer's dog uncovered a secret that silenced the village. They would say that truth does not always arrive in the voice of men. Sometimes it comes on 4 steady paws, guided by instinct, devotion, and a courage that asks for nothing in return. In the winter of 1907, before the first light touched the snow-covered roofs of Ashford Hollow, a dog began clawing at the frozen earth beside the old railway shed. The sound was sharp and frantic, echoing through the stillness of dawn. It was not the restless scraping of an animal chasing a scent. It was deliberate, desperate, as though time itself were buried beneath the ice. The dog belonged to Margaret Hale, the village telegraph keeper. Since her husband had been lost in a rail accident 5 years earlier, she had lived alone in the narrow wooden cottage beside the tracks. Her days were measured by the ticking of the telegraph key and the distant whistle of passing trains. Her only constant companion was the dog, a large brindled shepherd named Bracken, whose quiet loyalty had become the rhythm of her solitary life. Ashford Hollow was a small rail town carved into the edge of a vast pine forest. Wooden platforms creaked under heavy boots. Coal smoke clung to the air. The railway shed stood at the far end of the line, half swallowed by drifting snow, its doors rarely opened except for storage of tools and spare timber. That morning, Bracken would not come when Margaret called. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped into the bitter cold. The sky was pale gray, the world hushed beneath a heavy blanket of white. Bracken was near the shed, digging beside its outer wall where the snow had hardened into crust. "Bracken," she called gently. The dog paused only long enough to look at her. His eyes were wide, alert, and filled with urgency she had never seen before. Then he resumed digging, claws striking frozen soil beneath the snow. Margaret felt a quiet unease. There had been rumors the night before. A freight train delayed. A signal sent late. Some said a lantern had been seen swinging wildly along the northern bend of track. But no one had spoken of danger. Yet Bracken dug as if someone were waiting beneath the earth. Margaret approached slowly. The dog stopped and pressed his nose to a narrow gap between the shed's foundation stones. A faint sound escaped from within. At first she thought it was the wind moving through boards. Then she heard it again. A weak, muffled knock. Her heart stumbled in her chest. She hurried to the shed doors and pulled at the iron handle. They did not move. The doors were secured from the outside with a heavy chain and padlock. Another faint knock came from within. Margaret's breath trembled in the cold air. She ran back to the cottage and returned with a lantern and a small hammer. Her hands shook as she struck the lock again and again. The metal resisted, stubborn and cold. Bracken barked sharply, then ran to the side wall, scratching near a loose plank at the base. Margaret understood. She dropped to her knees in the snow and pried at the weakened board. The wood splintered under pressure. A small opening appeared, dark and narrow. From inside came a strained voice, "Help." It was barely more than a whisper. Margaret's pulse roared in her ears. She widened the gap enough to see movement within the shadowed shed. A young railway worker lay bound near a stack of timber, his coat dusted with sawdust, his face pale from cold. It was Thomas Avery, the night signalman. He had not returned home after his shift. Bracken forced his way through the opening, squeezing into the shed and rushing to the man's side. He began tugging at the ropes with his teeth. Margaret ran for help, shouting through the frozen street. Within minutes, 2 railway men and the town constable arrived with tools. The chain was cut, the doors thrown open, and the young signalman carried out into the pale morning light. His lips were blue. His wrists were raw. When warmth returned to him, he spoke in fragments. A figure had approached him on the northern track during the night, a man he did not recognize. There had been an argument, a struggle. He had been struck from behind and dragged to the shed. The attacker had meant to tamper with the signal system to force a freight train off schedule for reasons yet unknown. But the plan had not been completed. because Bracken had begun to howl long before dawn. The dog had heard something Margaret had not. Perhaps the faint cry carried by wind. Perhaps the unfamiliar scent lingering in snow. Whatever it was, he had refused to rest. He had pulled at Margaret's coat in the night, pacing near the door, until at last she followed him outside. And that was the moment everything began to shift. The constable organized a search of the northern bend. Footprints were found near the rails, half covered by drifting snow. A lantern lay discarded in a ditch. The tracks had been disturbed, a signal lever loosened just enough to cause confusion in timing. Had the morning freight passed unchecked, two trains might have met on the same stretch of narrow line. The consequences would have been unthinkable. By dusk, a suspect was found hiding near the old timber bridge, a dismissed rail worker who had sworn revenge after losing his post. He was taken into custody without struggle, his shoulders bowed under the weight of what had nearly occurred. Ashford Hollow stood silent that evening. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin lines against the darkening sky. Inside her cottage, Margaret sat beside the hearth, Bracken's head resting heavily on her lap. Thomas Avery had survived. The railway was safe. The village would wake to another ordinary morning. But Margaret understood how close they had come to tragedy. She ran her fingers slowly through Bracken's fur. The dog's breathing was steady now, calm after the storm he alone had sensed. He lifted his eyes to hers, quiet and trusting, as if unaware of what he had prevented. In the days that followed, the story traveled along the rails to neighboring towns. They spoke of the loyal dog who uncovered danger buried in snow, of the animal who refused silence when lives were at stake. Yet in Ashford Hollow, the tale was told more softly. They would say that on a frozen morning in 1907, when fear lay hidden beneath timber and chain, it was not a man who first raised alarm. It was a dog who listened more closely than the rest of the world. And because of that listening, a life was saved, a disaster was averted, and a quiet railway town carried on beneath the steady rhythm of passing trains, never forgetting the sound of claws against frozen earth.